52 years of armed conflict between FARC and the rest of the country. You were able to bring it to an end. That is the work that you won the Nobel Peace Prize for in 2016. I want to go back a little bit and see where this journey started for you, because it started with a decision to make a lifelong pursuit out of finding a solution to this conflict. When was the moment where you're like, this is my life's purpose?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and it's a great pleasure to be interviewed by you. And it's a peace process that was not made by me. It's made by a lot of people, by the Colombian people, especially by the victims. I think the credit goes to them. This started many, many years ago. I was recently introduced to public life. I wanted to open the economy. I was named a Minister of Trade. And I went to a conference like this one to attract investment to Colombia. And when we were in the middle of the conference, a big bomb exploded in the capital city. And of course, the conference failed. And the investors, one of them, very important, the CEO, said to me, Minister, you will never have investment and development in your country as long as you have this war. Those words stuck in my mind, and some months afterwards, I had to give to Nelson Mandela, the chair of the 8th Conference of the United Nations for Trade and Development. And I went to South Africa, I gave him the chair, and a meeting that we had planned for 15 minutes went on for 5 hours. Wow. And he said more or less the same words that as this CEO told me in New York. As long as you have war, you will never have a good country, a developed country. And at that moment I said, this is going to be the objective of my life, to fight for peace in Colombia after 52 years of war. And that was what, in a way, triggered the action that we took many years looking for peace, and we finally signed it.
So it started with the decision to take a big risk. I mean, we've seen from history that it can be a deadly undertaking. Heads of state have lost their lives before in pursuit of peace. How did you go about bringing the two sides to the negotiating table? I mean, your predecessors have tried and they had failed. So how were you going to bring a fresh approach to this?
I did a very thorough study of 17 different peace processes in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, the South African peace process, in Sri Lanka, in Liberia, and we started identifying what were the conditions that made peace possible. And every conflict has special conditions, and we identified 4 conditions in the case of Colombia, and we started creating those conditions. Conditions don't appear from one day to another out of the blue. You have to create them. And so we started creating those conditions. It had to do with the military effectiveness of the armed forces. It had to do with our neighbors. In today's world, any solution of an asymmetrical war, as it is called, has to have the support of the region, and if need be, of the international community. An armed conflict has to be recognized in the case of Colombia in order to apply, and this is very important, to apply the rules of the Rome Statute and to apply transitional justice. Without transitional justice, you cannot have a peace process. So those conditions were created, and the most important one is to convince your counterpart, that is, especially the commanders, that for them, personally, it's better to negotiate peace than to continue in the war. And that has to be done sometimes with a carrot or sometimes with a stick. And we used both. And we convinced them, and that's how we brought them to the negotiating table in some special conditions that allow us at the end to have peace.
I mean, as far as you were concerned, there also was a need to shift the psychological approach to the conversation, reframe perhaps enemies to adversaries. And this comes as well from another point in your life where you got some insight into how a different perspective can make a big difference.
Oh yes, I remember when I was appointed Minister of Defense to lead the war against the FARC, the guerrillas. A very intelligent general, he had retired, he was a friend of my father, and I went to his house to seek his advice. And he said, listen, the FARC, you have to treat them as your adversaries, not your enemies. The enemies you destroy. These are human beings. These are Colombians. They are your adversaries. You beat them, but you don't destroy them because you're going to have to live with them for the rest of your lives or with their families. And this had a profound effect in the way that I started introducing in the military the idea of having as a priority the respect for human rights, the respect even for the human rights of your adversaries. And this gave the military a tremendous legitimacy and support of the people, which was very important to attain our objectives.
You mentioned some of the opposition that you faced over the years. It was a hard sell. People were sort of trapped in their boxes and their ways of thinking. When you're looking back, what was a point where you said, this is quite a tough one to cross, a tough bridge to cross in terms of domestic resistance?
Well, it's incredible that after so many years of war, people get accustomed to war. And they started losing the power of feeling compassion even. And when we started a peace process, people were afraid of peace. It sounds crazy, but that was the fact. And many people live out of war. There are different interests, maybe political or maybe economic interests. The drug traffickers want the country in war because they can do their business better. And so there are different interests that get together to oppose a peace process. And another thing was the fact of applying for the first time transitional justice in a country where, and this is the case of most of the countries around the world, the traditional justice, the one that simply puts you in jail for a long time, against the transitional justice which doesn't put you in jail but forces you to repair your victims and to pay society in another way. This is very difficult for many people to accept. So I had a lot of opposition for political reasons and for cultural and traditional reasons. And so I had to persevere very strongly. As a matter of fact, I lost a referendum. I put the peace process to a referendum, and I lost it by a very small percentage, but I lost it. And I had to renegotiate the peace agreement to have a new agreement approved by the different authorities. But there was a tremendous resistance, and it was because of the international community, the support of the international community, that we were able to follow through.
I want to zero in a little bit on the components for making this peace process sustainable. It's no secret that Colombia is the cocaine capital of the world. To this day, it still exports the most, and year on year in 2017, these are United Nations figures, the numbers actually increased in terms of the amount of cocaine that's being exported. Crop replacement was a crucial component of your program, wasn't it? But the healing process is still going to take time. It's not something that just happens overnight, and it still relies on international support as well.
Yeah. Yes, one of the basic aspects of this agreement was precisely to agree with the FARC to do away with the illegal crops. It had at the beginning a perverse effect because people say, oh, they're going to pay the people who have been growing coca. And so the plantations were increased. But it's the only solution, and fortunately it's starting to work. Last year it worked very well, of giving the peasants that grow coca an alternative. Because before we've been fighting the drugs for 40 years, and we spray them and we force them to eradicate, but if we don't give them an alternative, they will go back to planting coca. So we agreed with the FARC that they would help the process of convincing the peasants to change from illegal crops to legal crops. And it's the only way, and it's starting to work, and I think if we maintain this policy, we will, for the first time, not be the #1 exporters of cocaine to world markets.
There have been setbacks along the way, and so I want to get your view on how this is going to look like longer term. I mean, how do you sustain the wins that you've been able to build up? And even though you do take a step back, and sometimes it's a painful step back where people lose their lives, the transition is real and is happening. But again, how do you make this stay and make it progress going forward?
Well, I've learned many things during this process. I will tell you one lesson that I received, which for me was very important. At the beginning, I thought the victims, we have more than 8 million victims of this war, were going to be the ones who would object to some kind of leniency for the guerrillas for their crimes, because they were the ones who suffered directly the effects of war. Well, I discovered that I was wrong. The victims were the ones who supported me the most, saying, we don't want other people to suffer what we suffered. It was extremely important for me to have that sort of re-energizer to persevere. The fact that I was, at the beginning of the process, considered a hawk, and this is an interesting evolution. I was elected President of Colombia by the highest margin of votes ever in the year 2010 because I was a successful Minister of Defense against the FARC, so I was a hero making war. And then when I started sitting down with the FARC to negotiate peace, people said, oh, why did he change? Why doesn't he continue killing the guerrillas? Because that's why we elected him. So that change was extremely difficult to explain to the people, that you have to weaken your adversary to bring him to the table and then negotiate. Because many wanted me to continue the war, and I said, no, now it's time to stop the war and negotiate a long-term peace. Now, one thing is to negotiate the peace, is what we call peacemaking. Another more difficult thing is to construct the peace after you sign the agreement. That takes a lot of time, that takes much more effort, and it's more difficult. And that's the process we're going through right now. We signed the peace, they gave up their arms, they're now in the guerrillas in the political arena, but the country is just starting this process of reconciliation, which has to do with education, to teach the children, the boys and the girls, that Through dialogue, you can solve the problems, to teach them to respect other people that think differently, and this takes quite a long time and a lot of effort.
You've had a few critical moments, to say the least, in your journey, and I'm thinking back to a moment early on in your administration when you had cornered the head of the FARC in the mountains, and I'm assuming you got a call, and they asked you, what do we do with the guy? Do we take him back alive, or do we assassinate him? And this was at a moment as well, just for perspective, when you were just beginning to put together the pieces of trust and the pieces of the puzzle of the peace process. What did you do then? And why did you decide the way you did?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I studied many different peace processes. One of them that I studied very closely was the peace process between Israel and Palestine. And what Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, did. And he said, I will negotiate with terrorism as if there is no peace process. And I will fight terrorism as if there is no conversation. So it's war in the middle of the conversation. And so I applied that doctrine. I call it the Rabin doctrine. It cost him his life. He was assassinated afterwards. But those were the rules of the game that I told the FARC. We will start conversations, secret conversations, but we will continue the war. Until we have an agreement, we will continue the war. And so when I was called by the commander of my army and said, we have the leader of the FARC located, do we do an operation against him? I knew that it will cost him his life, because I knew that he would not give himself up. But I needed the support of the military, and I needed the respect of the FARC. And they knew that these were the rules of the game, because when we negotiated, I told them, you can kill me during the conversations because we continue in the war. It was very rough, very crude, but that was the reality. And so I took the decision to authorize the operation, and he was killed. And afterwards, not long time ago, when I sat with some of the leaders of the guerrillas to ask them, and they said, we were very mad, but those were the rules of the game, and we respected you for doing that. We thought it was a tough decision, but in the long run, I think it's those very difficult decisions that you have to make to seek a more important objective.
From all your experiences over the years, you look at the world map right now, there is no shortage of conflict. I'm thinking of the recent tensions right now in Venezuela. I mean, how do you extrapolate perhaps from your experience to what's happening there? And now that you've stepped away from the presidency recently only, really, maybe you can share some of your thoughts on that, since you might have a little bit more freedom to share your opinion.
Well, I had to suffer the Venezuelan situation as president. I received more than 1.2 million refugees from Venezuela. This was a tremendous pressure on our economy, we gave them education for their kids, we gave them the health services, and it was and it's still a very difficult situation. I would say that today, what is happening today is a very dangerous situation, because they're playing a game that in the United States is called chicken. It's a game where two cars at high speed go once against the other to see who turns first. If nobody turns, they will crash and they will get killed. And they're playing chicken today in Venezuela. And what I hope and what I recommend is to avoid, by all means, a bloodbath. This would be the worst of all outcomes, because it would be terrible for Venezuela, Venezuela is not a country accustomed to violence, but there are a lot of people armed in Venezuela. In the last 20 years, people have been given AK-47s. There's hundreds of thousands of militias with AK-47s under their bed. And if this starts to become a civil war, it'll be very, very costly. So we have to avoid, by all means, violence and a bloodbath. So the only way to find a solution is through negotiation. And I think the moment is ripe to design what we call a golden bridge for the regime to have a dignified way out. But that has to be negotiated. It cannot be imposed. Otherwise, there will be a bloodbath.
Mr. President, thank you very much for joining the discussion here on stage today. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.